When the avoidant first senses that the anxious person is no longer circling around them with the same intensity, something subtle yet deeply unsettling begins to shift inside them. They've always relied on the anxious partner's consistent attention like an invisible safety net, even while pretending they didn't need it. That steady stream of reassurance allowed them to keep their distance without truly risking loss, and it created an illusion of control that became central to how they navigate connection. But when the anxious person suddenly stops reaching out, stops initiating conversations, and begins to create emotional space, the avoidant feels that illusion slipping through their fingers. What they once took for granted starts to feel fragile, like it could vanish entirely, and this sparks an internal panic they can't quite name because they're not used to feeling powerless in relationships. The control they've clung to isn't real anymore, and they're forced to notice how much of their security depended on someone else holding the emotional weight. They start replaying the past interactions in their mind, searching for clues about what changed, because part of their control relied on believing they could predict the anxious person's behavior. When the anxious partner was predictable, it allowed the avoidant to stay distant while still feeling safe, but unpredictability makes them anxious in a way they don't understand. That predictability fed their ego, reassured their sense of worth, and convinced them they had the upper hand emotionally. Losing it shatters their confidence in the dynamic, and it creates this strange sense of disorientation that quietly eats at their composure. They might even begin to check in on the anxious partner from a distance, looking for any small sign that they're still being thought about. But those signs are fewer and farther between. And with every unanswered text or ignored gesture, the realization that they are no longer the center of that person's emotional world starts digging deeper into their mind. The absence of pursuit makes them hyper-aware of how much they depended on it to feel secure, even though they used to act indifferent. They start noticing small things they once overlooked, like how silence feels heavier than it used to, or how conversations with other people don't satisfy them the way the anxious person's attention did. They used to think they wanted space, but now that they have it, the space feels cold and hollow, like a room that's been emptied of warmth. This contradiction confuses them because it challenges the story they tell themselves about being better off alone, and it forces them to question why they feel so unsteady without something they once claimed they didn't need. The loss of control reveals how emotionally dependent they actually were, and it shakes their internal structure in a way they try to hide behind calmness or detachment. But the cracks are forming, and they can feel it even if they don't show it. They may start trying subtle ways to regain that lost control, testing to see if they can pull the anxious partner's attention back just enough to feel balanced again. They might post something on social media they know will get noticed, drop indirect comments meant to provoke curiosity, or show up in small ways that seem coincidental but are quietly calculated. Each of these actions is a way of reaching for the sense of power they lost, because if they can get even a hint of the old dynamic back, they can soothe the discomfort they're carrying. But when those attempts don't work, or worse, when they're met with indifference, it magnifies their sense of losing control even more. It's like trying to grab smoke. The more they chase it, the more it slips through their hands, and that loss of grip intensifies their internal spiral. As they lose the sense of control they built their emotional safety on, they start to realize just how much of their confidence was tied to someone else consistently validating them. This realization doesn't come as a sudden insight, but as a creeping awareness that their self-image is weaker than they thought. They believed they were unaffected, distant by choice, and in control because they cared less. But the absence of the anxious partner's attention exposes how much they relied on it to feel important. It leaves them standing in emotional freefall without the predictable pattern that used to make them feel safe, and that uncertainty feels like the ground has disappeared beneath their feet. When the anxious partner withdraws and the avoidant starts feeling the absence of that consistent emotional presence, a deep and unfamiliar sense of uncertainty begins to rise inside them. This uncertainty creeps in quietly at first, like a background noise they can't quite place, but it gradually becomes impossible to ignore. They were used to the anxious partner always being there, always initiating, always offering reassurance even when it wasn't asked for, and that created a sense of rhythm they could rely on. It allowed them to predict what would happen next, and predictability is what gave them a false feeling of safety. When that pattern suddenly breaks, they find themselves in uncharted emotional territory, unsure what to expect, and that lack of clarity makes them deeply uneasy. They may try to tell themselves they don't care, that they're fine with the distance, but the truth is that the sudden silence strips away the emotional map they were following, and without it, they feel lost in a way they don't want to admit. As this uncertainty grows, it begins to erode their emotional composure, making them second-guess every small interaction they've had with the anxious person. They start wondering what triggered this change, what moment made the anxious partner decide to pull away, and whether it's permanent or temporary. These questions loop through their mind, and because avoidants are not comfortable sitting with vulnerability, they struggle to process these doubts openly. Instead, they bottle it up, hoping it will pass, but it doesn't. The anxious person's absence makes them realize how much they depended on their presence to provide emotional clarity, and now every silence feels like a question they can't answer. This spinning uncertainty creates an undercurrent of tension that seeps into other parts of their life, distracting them even when they try to focus on something else. The security they once felt begins to feel like it was an illusion, and that realization unsettles them more than they expect. They start to notice how fragile their emotional stability is without the anchor of predictability. Before, even if they pulled away, they knew they could expect the anxious person to keep reaching out, and that expectation allowed them to feel like they had control over the relationship's trajectory. Without that anchor, they're left floating, and that floating quickly turns into a feeling of being untethered. This sensation is foreign to them because they've built their identity on appearing independent and unaffected, yet now they feel like they're standing on shaky ground. They may try to distract themselves, dive into work or other connections, but nothing fully soothes the quiet panic building underneath. Each day that passes without a message or gesture from the anxious partner deepens the uncertainty, making them feel as though the ground beneath them is slowly cracking. The comfort of knowing what to expect has vanished, and the unknown looms like a shadow they can't shake. As they sit in this uncertainty, their mind begins to fill in the silence with assumptions, and these assumptions often lean toward the worst-case scenarios. They might convince themselves the anxious partner has moved on, found someone else, or stopped caring entirely, and these thoughts trigger a rush of insecurity they aren't equipped to handle. They start over-analyzing every past moment, trying to find clues that explain why this shift happened, and this mental replay only fuels their anxiety further. The very detachment they use to protect themselves now becomes a trap because it prevents them from seeking reassurance, leaving them stuck in their own speculation. This internal storm of questions, doubts, and imagined outcomes spins faster the longer the anxious partner stays distant, making them feel like they're losing their emotional footing. It becomes harder to mask their inner turmoil behind their usual calm exterior, and they begin to withdraw even more, hoping it will bring relief, but it only amplifies the void they feel. This growing uncertainty begins to challenge the avoidant's entire belief system about relationships and control. They once believed they could control intimacy by managing distance, by staying detached enough to avoid getting hurt, but this situation shows them how powerless they actually are. The anxious partner's withdrawal proves that no amount of detachment can guarantee security, and that realization destabilizes them. It forces them to confront a truth they've spent years avoiding, that relationships are not predictable, and emotional safety can't be maintained by holding people at arm's length. This recognition doesn't come as an instant epiphany, but as a slow unraveling of the confidence they once had. And with each passing day of silence, the uncertainty deepens, spreading through every thought like a quiet storm they can't escape. When the anxious partner stops chasing and starts avoiding, jealousy begins to rise inside the avoidant in ways they didn't expect and don't know how to handle. At first, it shows up as a vague irritation they can't explain, a restlessness that follows them around even in moments that should feel normal. They were used to being the center of the anxious partner's focus, always receiving glances, check-ins, and emotional energy, and that gave them a sense of quiet reassurance they rarely admitted to themselves. Now that focus is gone and their mind starts wondering where it went, they picture the anxious person giving their attention to someone else, laughing with someone new, building emotional connections somewhere outside their reach, and those thoughts sting more than they want to admit. The idea of being replaced awakens something primal inside them, a surge of protectiveness mixed with fear, and they find themselves wanting back the very attention they once pushed away. This jealousy doesn't look like dramatic outbursts or open confrontation, because that would require admitting they care, and avoidants struggle to do that. Instead, it seeps out in indirect ways, like subtle bitterness in their tone, dismissive comments about the anxious partner's new behavior, or sudden interest in who they're spending time with. They might scroll through old messages, search for signs of new connections on social media, or ask mutual friends casual questions that are loaded with curiosity. These are quiet attempts to confirm they're still significant, that they haven't been forgotten, because the thought of being replaced threatens their fragile sense of importance. Every time they see the anxious person smiling in a photo or hear about them enjoying life without them, it triggers a pang of envy that clashes violently with the detached image they try to project. They become hyper-aware of how much space they've lost in the anxious partner's world. And the jealousy grows heavier as they realize they can't control where that attention goes now. They also begin comparing themselves to the imagined people who might now be receiving the attention they once took for granted. Their mind crafts scenarios where the anxious partner is connecting more deeply with someone else, giving them the emotional energy they use to offer freely, and this comparison makes the avoidant feel inadequate in ways they rarely experience. It challenges the identity they built around being self-sufficient and above needing constant affection, because suddenly they want that affection back and fear they can't compete for it anymore. This comparison game becomes a quiet obsession, playing on repeat in the background of their mind, and each imagined scene makes them feel smaller, less significant, like they're fading from someone's story they thought they'd always be part of. That fear of being replaced feeds the jealousy until it becomes impossible to ignore, and they start to see how much their sense of value was tied to being pursued. The jealousy also exposes how emotionally dependent they had become without realizing it. They once believed they could step away at any time without feeling the loss, but now they feel the anxious person's absence like a void, and seeing them possibly giving their attention to someone else sharpens that void into pain. It forces them to confront the truth that they did care all along, and that caring makes them feel vulnerable, which is deeply uncomfortable for them. They might try to suppress it by distracting themselves with other people or activities, but nothing fully dulls the sting, because jealousy isn't about logic. It's about fear of losing something they never admitted they needed. Each attempt to ignore it only makes it more persistent, like a shadow that stretches across everything they do, reminding them that they are no longer the priority they once were. As jealousy intensifies, it begins to shift their behavior in small but noticeable ways, making them act in ways they don't recognize. They may try to regain the anxious partner's attention indirectly, dropping subtle hints, showing up where they might be seen, or posting things designed to provoke a reaction, all while pretending it doesn't matter to them. This push to reassert their presence is driven by the need to soothe the ache jealousy has created, because if they can pull the anxious partner's focus back even slightly, they can momentarily silence the fear of being replaced. But when those attempts are met with indifference or no response at all, the jealousy twists deeper, making them feel invisible, and that invisibility becomes one of the most painful experiences they've faced. It dismantles the image they had of themselves as the one in control, and instead leaves them staring at the reality that they are no longer being chosen, no longer being thought of, and that realization cuts through their detachment like nothing else can. When the anxious partner begins to avoid them, something unexpected happens inside the avoidant. The emotions they worked so hard to bury start rising to the surface, catching them completely off guard. They've spent so long suppressing their feelings, pushing them down under layers of logic and detachment, that they've almost convinced themselves those emotions were gone. But the sudden absence of the anxious person's warmth acts like a trigger, cracking open the vault they've kept sealed for so long. Old memories of shared moments they brushed aside begin replaying in their mind, tiny fragments of laughter, vulnerability, and closeness they once dismissed as insignificant. Now those moments echo louder than ever, and instead of feeling comfort from the space they once craved, they feel haunted by what they've lost. It creates a strange emotional dissonance because they can't reconcile the person they believed themselves to be, cold, independent, immune to attachment, with the person who is now quietly aching for what they pushed away. This resurfacing of buried feelings doesn't come gently, it comes like a flood, all at once and without warning. They might find themselves thinking about the anxious partner at random times, in quiet spaces where distractions fade, and each thought stirs up a cocktail of regret, longing, and confusion. They start wondering if they misunderstood their own feelings all along, if maybe the connection meant more to them than they were willing to see. That realization is deeply unsettling because it dismantles the emotional framework they've built their identity on. They were used to staying in control by avoiding depth, but now depth is all they can feel, and they don't know how to contain it. It makes them restless, like they want to reach out but can't, because that would mean admitting they care, and vulnerability feels like stepping off a cliff. The very walls that once made them feel safe now feel like a prison holding them back from the connection they secretly crave. As these emotions surface, they also begin to feel an ache of unfinished business, a sense that they left things unsaid or moments unappreciated, and that realization weighs on them heavily. They remember times the anxious partner offered closeness that they shrugged off, times they could have chosen tenderness but chose distance instead, and those missed chances now feel like wounds. The silence they used to find comforting has turned into a reminder of everything they let slip through their fingers. This recognition sparks guilt, though they wouldn't call it that out loud, because guilt implies they did something wrong, and admitting that feels dangerous to their pride. Still, it lingers inside them, soft and heavy, making them question if they were too quick to run from something that could have been real. It's not just the loss of attention they feel now, it's the loss of meaning, and that kind of emptiness is harder for them to push away. This emotional unraveling makes them hypersensitive to anything that reminds them of the anxious partner, and these reminders seem to appear everywhere. A song they once heard together, a place they visited, even the way certain words are said can trigger flashes of feeling they can't control. These emotional intrusions catch them off guard because they've built their life around control, around keeping emotions in neatly locked compartments, and now those compartments are breaking open without their permission. Each reminder brings a wave of sadness, longing, and nostalgia that they can't explain away, and it leaves them feeling unsteady. They start to realize how much of their emotional detachment was just a defense, a strategy to protect themselves from being hurt, and with the anxious partner now distant, that defense feels hollow. The feelings they buried were never gone. They were just waiting for a crack in the armor to pour through. As these hidden emotions keep surfacing, they begin to feel overwhelmed by their own inner world, like they are drowning in feelings they never wanted to have. They can't talk about it easily because words feel too raw, and they fear that admitting any of it will make them look weak or dependent. So they stay silent, trying to carry the weight alone, even though it grows heavier each day. The emotional numbness they once wore like armor has disappeared, leaving them exposed to every sharp edge of longing and regret. It becomes hard to focus, hard to sleep, hard to pretend they are unaffected, because the truth is louder now than their denial. They are finally feeling what they spent so long avoiding, and it shakes the foundations of who they believed they were, leaving them standing in the ruins of their own emotional defenses as everything they buried rises up to confront them all at once. When the anxious partner starts avoiding them, the avoidant begins to experience subtle cracks in the carefully crafted self-image they've carried for so long, and those cracks grow wider with each passing day of silence. They've always seen themselves as independent, emotionally untouchable, and self-sufficient, the kind of person who doesn't need anyone to feel whole. That belief has been their shield, the story they tell themselves to stay safe from vulnerability, but the absence of the anxious partner's constant reassurance shakes that story at its core. They start questioning why the withdrawal hurts as much as it does if they were truly as detached as they believed. The mirror they've been looking into begins to distort, showing glimpses of need, longing, and insecurity that they've spent years hiding from. This quiet identity crisis gnaws at them from the inside, making them wonder if the version of themselves they've been protecting is only half real, built more on fear than strength. As their self-image starts to crack, they also become painfully aware of how much they relied on external validation to maintain their confidence. When the anxious partner was pursuing them, it created an ongoing feedback loop that made them feel desired, admired, and significant. And they mistook that feeling for self-worth. Now that loop has been broken, they find themselves facing a silence that offers no validation at all, and without it, their confidence feels strangely hollow. They may try to fill the gap by seeking attention from others, chasing compliments, or performing indifference more loudly than before, but nothing truly lands the way it used to. Each attempt feels like a hollow echo that fades quickly, leaving them emptier than before, and that emptiness forces them to see how fragile their self-assurance really is. It's not just that they miss the anxious partner's presence, it's that without it, they're struggling to remember who they are without someone reflecting their worth back to them. This internal unraveling creates a tension between the image they present to the world and the truth they feel inside, and holding that tension is exhausting. On the outside, they may still appear calm, collected, and indifferent, but inside they're tangled in doubt, questioning whether they've built their identity on avoiding closeness because they feared they weren't enough. Every time they tell themselves they don't care, the silence from the anxious partner contradicts them, whispering that if they didn't care, this wouldn't hurt. This contradiction makes them feel like they're living two lives, the one where they appear unaffected and the one where they silently ache, and that split starts to wear them down. They may even catch themselves imagining what it would feel like to drop the act, to admit they wanted to be chosen, but the thought of showing that vulnerability terrifies them. So they keep the mask on even as it begins to feel heavier because they don't know who they are without it. The cracks in their self-image also bring old insecurities to the surface, insecurities they thought they had outgrown. They start questioning their desirability, wondering if maybe the anxious partner left because they weren't interesting enough, not warm enough, not lovable enough, and these questions linger like shadows in their mind. They had always believed distance made them powerful, that being hard to reach made them more valuable, but now that very distance feels like the reason they were left behind. This realization eats at their pride, because it forces them to see how much of their identity was tied to being wanted without effort. When that effortless desire disappears, they're left facing the possibility that they were never as secure as they thought, and that possibility terrifies them. It makes every memory of pushing the anxious partner away sting like a missed opportunity to prove they were worthy of love. As the anxious partner's absence stretches on, the avoidant starts to see that the image of strength they've clung to has been built on fragile foundations, and without constant reinforcement, it's crumbling. They feel exposed, like the armor they've worn for so long is slipping off, revealing the softer, more uncertain parts of themselves they've always hidden. They don't know how to rebuild that image now that they can see through it themselves, and this uncertainty about their own identity leaves them disoriented. They used to believe they were untouchable, that they could walk away without looking back, but now they're caught in the quiet realization that they depended on someone else's presence to feel whole. The persona of being self-contained no longer fits, but they're too afraid to let it go, and that inner conflict keeps tearing at them from the inside as they struggle to hold together a version of themselves that no longer feels true.